Welcome to Difference Makers, the podcast that explores people making a difference across planet Earth. I am your host, Joni Readout. On this episode of Difference Makers, I'm here with Joe Beckman. Joe is the co-founder of Till 360 Consulting. His mission has been to reclaim human connections in school communities throughout the world. Joe has shared his infectious energy, humor, and passion with over 2,500 schools. He has positively impacted over 1 million people through live speaking events, YouTube videos, and his books. Just look up 5 life-saving phrases every human needs to hear in his newest book, Just Look Back, 5 life-saving ways to create your legacy. There it is. I'm so excited to get my copy. Thank you for being with us, Joe. We're excited to hear about your difference maker experiences.
Absolutely, Joni. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for putting out awesome content into the world around making a difference. We need everyone doing it, so excited to be here.
Who are the people in your life that have been difference makers? How have those people been difference makers in your life?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when, generally speaking, I get that question, I think of the people who've had the biggest impact in my life, right? You think about mom and dad and wife and best friend and coach and all those people. But I like to talk about it sometimes in those little smaller like moments, those sparks that we get from sometimes random people that don't make a huge impact in our life in the moment, but somehow they're breathing confidence into us when they did at the time actually started a ripple effect that goes further than our eyes can see. So I think of Patsy. Now, who's Patsy? Every Saturday was my favorite day to go to the grocery store with my mom because it was food sample day. And I would go and we would go up the different aisles and I would get everything from mini tacos to bacon wrapped sausages to cookies or whatever. And I remember it wasn't just the samples that I loved. That was very like food was a very strong incentive for this child. But every time we would check out, my mom would go to the same aisle and the same person, no matter how long her line was. And usually it was long. And there was a reason for it. Her name was Patsy. And Patsy, she made every person that went through her line feel like they were kind of a rock star. And I would watch that. And I'm, 5-year-old Joe, and literally, like, I can still remember it. She would stop when she would see me, and she would just hold off all conversation. She would like put a hand up, and she would look at me like she had seen her favorite person that she's, hasn't seen in years. And then when it was my turn to come up, she would have me come around, and she'd give me a hug, and she would say, "Joey, you are a special little boy." And I needed that, even as a 5-year-old, right? Like we need to hear that, and like I believed it. And I think part of why I do what I do now in many ways is because small interactions like that, where people just, breathe a little bit of life into me that I think, has a huge ripple effect in my story and some of the impact that I've made. So I'm going to bring up Patsy as being one of my main difference makers there.
It's cool as I continue to have these conversations around the same 3 questions. Encouragers or being encouraging is always one of the skills that people have that are difference makers, whether they're big difference makers, like you said, or someone that just did the little things like Patsy every Saturday. But like the idea of encouraging is just, it's across everybody I talk to.
And I think it's one of those superpowers that everybody has access to, but we don't think of it as a superpower. But it's something that we can all do, whether it's just a quick little note to a coworker or a conversation, but just when we can highlight the gifts of other people and say it out loud. And I think what happens, it's like a practice. We get better at it as we do it, and then we start seeing like the ripple effect of it, or maybe we don't see it, but the more we can practice it, the better we get at it. The better we get at it, the more we do it. The more we do it, the more people it encourages. And hopefully that, again, I keep saying ripple effect, but that continues to pass on farther than we can go. But it is like a really interesting point that you bring up, how valuable that is. In fact, I'm just going to go off on a side tangent. They actually came out with the latest research on gratitude. And we've always known that gratitude is super impactful. Like when we think about what we're grateful for, or we meditate on that, or we take a little bit of time to envision it. But what their latest research is showing that the biggest benefits of gratitude isn't just when we feel it, but when someone recognizes something in us that they're grateful for. And so when you take the time to honor somebody, encourage them, you are giving them the greatest gift you could possibly give them from a gratitude benefit perspective, right? And that's
So
physiological benefits, emotional benefits, spiritual benefits, not to mention, again, the contagious like effect that those things sort of have. So, yeah, great
that's
point.
so
And
cool.
like, yeah, it's like a small little thing that I think people sometimes don't realize how valuable that is.
Yeah, yeah. And the superpower idea, I've never called it that, but I say that when I talk to people that are difference makers or anybody when we're talking about having a positive influence is nobody ever brings up things that we don't or can't practice as humans. None of it is a tangible thing someone gives you and, oh, this is what you have, and then you're a difference maker and other people aren't.
Yeah, it's
So,
interesting. Yeah, we all have
yes,
access to it. Yeah.
yes.
And I think that's the benefit of, the work that you do as an educator and the work that I do as a speaker is we get to kind of give kids the opportunity to see that they have the opportunity and the like, you know what I mean? We give them the opportunities to practice it and build it, that skill. And so, yeah, I love that part of the work is just the light bulb moment that kids sometimes have when we come in and talk about being a difference maker and they're like, me? Even me? I'm like, yeah, it says anyone. It doesn't say fifth
Yeah.
grader, eighth grader, teacher, speaker, anyone. And when we break it down and say, and it's the small little things that all of us can do that add up, it just becomes so much more accessible. But when they can see that they can do it, oh man, that's like a big moment for them. So yeah, I
Yes.
appreciate that about the work that we get to do with kids.
Yes. Okay. So, how have you been a difference maker in the lives of others?
Oh man, that's a hard one because then you feel like you're bragging about yourself. But here's what I'll say. I've been a difference maker in the lives of others because part of my strength and part of my superpower is sort of saying yes to as many things as I possibly can and seeing where the cards lie afterwards, right? Instead of ready, fire, or ready, aim, 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 fire, I'm like ready, fire, aim, right? And so I think one of the ways I've been a difference maker, just kind of from a bigger perspective, is that I've taken a lot of risks in my life based on where my heart has told me to go. And so the ability for me to share a message, I've always felt like I was good at something like that. And so I kept saying yes to different opportunities, even when it was outside of my comfort zone. I was an athlete and had no business being an actor, but I tried out for a play and I got a part because I had this like, I want to do it, right? I think that's maybe the right way. So like my continual courage to follow my heart, I think is one way because it has led to so many awesome outcomes. And in a maybe a more like minuscule or smaller way, I wish you could read my Instagram like direct messages. And
Mm.
there's so many of those that I get that I don't even know what to do with because it feels like if I talk about it, I'm bragging or like, oh, look at me, I've changed somebody's life, or in some cases, according to what they write, saved somebody's life. Um, you don't know what to do with it. But if you could read it, you could see like it's interesting because I there's different points that people connect with. Sometimes it's the stories, sometimes it's the messages after the stories. Sometimes they're like, I just liked seeing a positive human being for 45 minutes, and I don't see that all the time, or whatever it may be. So it's interesting on what they connect with, but people do reach out for different reasons. And one that came in like 3 days ago, I got to have an opportunity to speak at a conference in Reno, Nevada for 1,500 educators in California who all went there. And I got a message from somebody afterwards who said, hey, just want you to know that throughout the conference, you continued to talk to me. And before you were even up on stage, you said to me, I see you. What you don't know is an hour before that, I was on the phone with my therapist talking about how invisible I feel and how nobody sees me and how I've been contemplating taking my own life. So, thanks for that interaction. I really needed that. And I thought, wow, like that had nothing to do with the talk. That had nothing to do with the messages. That had nothing to do with the stories. had everything to do with being present in the moment and encouraging, finding a moment where I could shine a little bit of light into someone else because you just don't know their story. And so I think that's one way that I continue and will challenge myself to continue to be difference maker for others is just to add a little bit of light to their story in small ways and to continue to be present and see those people that, maybe need a little bit of positivity or whatever it may be, and just be as abundant as I possibly can in how I give it out.
Mm. It's powerful when you talk about the recent research about gratitude and then that you get your bucket filled. And I know that question is tricky and everybody always tells me like, this is a hard one. Like I'm humble. But it is interesting to hear from people and for you to say that, when you look back through your direct messages from people, you don't know. That's part of my mission here too. You don't go out and make a difference for people because you are like, oh, that person, I got to seek them out. I'm going to do something special for them. A lot of times it's unplanned and you don't know. And luckily people reach out and tell you, but think of all the people that don't,
Right.
and
No,
we just have to
absolutely.
hope and know that our impact is being felt, but we don't know everybody's stories. And that's where when we impact people all the time, all day long, like leave the good. Let's leave the good.
Yeah, it can't hurt. You know what I mean? Whether they're having the best day of their life or they woke up on the wrong side of the bed or got some really bad news, it can't hurt. You know what I mean? To add a little bit. So why not just assume that they could use a little bit more? Because we all probably can in our own way. And again, just be abundant with it. And if, again, that's why I talk to kids about why it's so important, this human connection thing, because it's out there in front of us. Like if we keep our eyes up and open, we'll see where our kindness and compassion can be used. But if we're looking down all day long, we're disconnected, we're addicted to a screen, not only do we miss out on just the joy of human connection, which we need, but we miss out on all these opportunities where we can add light. And like the benefit of that isn't just for the person, although we should be going, that's the reason we do it, is to benefit others. But again, when we do that, it builds confidence in ourselves. We feel more purposeful in this world. We feel more connected and that we have value. And all of that plays into a bigger conversation around happiness and, showing up with a positive attitude. Like it all adds to that, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes. Like it fills us up, right? And we have
Yeah.
to do that in order to do it for other people. That's what I just had a conversation with a coworker the other day, and I was greeting kids in the restroom. Actually, I was walking in, and I always am real purposeful about saying the name of the student.
Yeah.
Because I think all that research is really powerful too, that like you know their name and you greet them and you look at them and you smile at people, right? And that's a strength I think I have. And one of my coworkers said, are you always like this? And I was like, that's an interesting question. I said, well, if you mean like, am I ever down? Like, yeah, that's human, right? I try not to let it affect my whole day. I try not to let it affect the people around me. And I try to have really good coping ways to deal. Luckily, I'm blessed and have been with some of the optimism that I have, and that you
Yeah.
work on that, you practice that. But it was just an interesting question to me. And I was like, gosh, I'm gonna have to think on that a little bit. Like, what do I do? And how do I keep this encouraging, optimistic? Like those children don't need anything else from me other than a hi, a smile, a good to see you, and their name.
Yeah.
I don't need the other stuff that's going on with me. And I think that's a
Yeah.
little bit of my perspective is like, we all have stuff going on. And I'm not saying that's not important or not valid or not all of those things, but learning ways, figuring out ways that you can work through those and then also be the good for people.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I don't know exactly what study this is, but I remember hearing Christopher Reeves talk about this. If you remember him, he was
Yes.
the original Superman,
Yes.
who had a horrific tragic accident and made him quadriplegic. And he was being asked in an interview, "Do you get down some days?" And he said, "Absolutely, of course I do." And on those days, what I found the best remedy is to start putting myself in other people's shoes and to serve and to help. And like that's how I get out of my own funk instead of just continuing it to be about me. I just start serving other people, and whatever reason that has a direct impact on, my own mental state and
Yeah.
mindset.
Yeah. It's cool. And to try to help build other people up to say, like, you have the power to do that too, right? You just have to figure out what works for you.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
self-awareness, right? That's the biggest thing. I think when I a lot of times do professional development, I'll do a values activity where it goes from like 100 values down to 12, down to 6, down to 3. And by the end, you're like, wow, these 3 that made it all the way through the vetting process, these are like my top 3 values. And sometimes just having that self-awareness is incredibly important. But then when you make decisions that are in line with these core values, you can't help but feel a little bit more in line in life, if that makes sense. And so,
Yes.
but it starts with that self-awareness and seeing, what am I passionate about? What do I value? And how can I make decisions that somehow allow that to flourish a little bit more?
Yeah, that's so cool. We've had some recent professional development around values and being in line with values or out of line with values, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, so in difference makers, what are the attributes or habits that you see in people who are difference makers?
So yeah, number one, and this is kind of the foundation to all of this stuff, is courage. It's not easy to be a difference maker. It takes a lot of, courage to stand up for what is right and what is good. And sometimes, and many times, it's not the popular decision. And so one of the strongest attribute is courage. But here's the other thing: failure. Being able to understand, and this kind of goes back into courage too, but it's okay. Like, we're not always going to be difference makers. In fact, I always say it when I'm doing live events: 10% of the time, we're probably difference makers, actively making a difference in people's life. But there's probably, if we're honest, 10% of the time where we're difference takers, where we might be saying the things or rolling the eyes or, somehow adding negatively to a situation. But then there's that 80%. That 80% is, if we're not being difference makers and takers in that moment, we're probably being what I call difference fakers, where we know the right thing to do. But oftentimes, because, there might be some social consequences, we don't stand up and do the right thing. And so I think part of being a difference maker is having the courage, but also giving yourself the grace to know that you're not always going to be a difference maker, but it's not like we want to stay 10%, 10%, 80%. I want to shift these numbers. What if 80% of the time we could be using our words and actions to build people up, and then maybe 10%, you give yourself a little grace in the difference taker category and in the difference faker category. But that's kind of how I break it down, is there's kind of 3 ways that I look at this difference maker thing. And to, I guess, answer your question, what are some attributes to difference makers, is to know that they don't have to be perfect, and to give yourself the grace to have bad days and maybe opportunities where you didn't step up, but challenging yourself to be better the next day, I guess. So it's a little bit of grace, but also at the same time, like a little bit of grit, I guess, a little grace and a little grit. I like that. A little
Yes,
alliteration.
that's awesome. And also the numbers, right? Like that goes back to the coworker comment that I had, like, no, I'm not
Yeah.
smiling, optimistic, full of energy 100% of my day, but I do try really hard to be self-aware of how much time I'm spending
Yeah.
in good and how much time I'm spending in a little bit of wallowing, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
and
whether I
and
need to share that.
it so there's science around this too. And this is why this matters, because relationships are an investment, like whether it's a coworker or a kid or your own child or your spouse. And what they found through research is, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but in general, this is kind of where it all lands, is that in order to have a relationship that thrives, that there needs to be a 5-to-1 ratio. And what that means is, for every 1 negative interaction, there needs to be 5 positive interactions. That's how heavy that's how much weight that negative action carries. And so, like you said, it's not about being perfect. But it's about getting to that healthy balance. Like, yep, I had a bad day or I had a bad moment or I lost my mind on a student, then
Yeah.
I should have probably handled it differently. And so, um, but what do I need to do now? I need to backfill that or I need to scaffold that with five positives. And that can be something as small as a smile, a hand on the shoulder, a compliment, laughing, a connection, whatever it may be. But for relationships to thrive, I think it's like you said, it's like you have to be intentional about where you're putting your energy, whether it's negative or positive, because that negative has such a strong weight and a strong tilt, I guess, to the whole relationship puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. So
Yeah,
cool. Thanks for sharing some of your difference maker experiences. It's been a
absolutely.
joy. I want to thank my guest today, Joe Beckman, and all of our listeners, because the real question here today is how will you be a difference maker? How are you a difference maker? Is it some of the same things that Joe is doing, or maybe something you want to do differently? Remember, you have the ability to be a difference maker for others, and others need you. We all impact people on a daily basis. Why not be the difference maker in the lives of others?